Although it bears no official name, the fleet of the Romulan Star Empire represents one of the most powerful navies in the known galaxy, fielding widely varied fleets of ships of widely differing size, power, role, capability, and combat effectiveness. The force has a long and diverse history of combat against many foes, and represents one of the most interesting navies in the current galactic community. The Star Navy is the primary space combat superiority force of the Romulan Star Empire. It is also responsible for transporting army units and gaining orbital superiority of worlds prior to their deployment. Importantly, the Navy is also responsible for directing the trade and mercantile fleets of the Empire. This being due to the planned economy of the state and the tight control the Senate imposes on all aspects of life within the Empire. While the Tal Shiar does itself possess an impressive fleet of its own, using many of the same designs as the regular Navy, and occasionally participates in combat operations, the Navy is in theory at least the premier battle force in the Empire, and takes the lead during combat operations where both have deployed forces. However, in practice, it often passes that the better politically connected commander leads the battle. The Star Navy of the Romulan Empire can trace its history all the way back to the colony fleet which the original refugees from Vulcan used to flee from the Serakian religious movement which had seized control of the planet. Well, this early fleet, which set out at the close of the 4th century, Old Earth date, was made up primarily of freighters and passenger ships. A few warships of the era were also present in the refugee fleet, which were expected to defend it in the event of pirates or Vulcan pursuit. Following the arrival of the colonists to the dual worlds that would become the future home worlds of the Empire, Romulus and Remus, this fledgling navy was likely abandoned. The early Romulan state, focusing on its survival, likely lacked the resources to maintain a space-based combat element. It would be almost 1,000 years before the Romulans would once again take to space, establishing a presence throughout the home system of the Empire and beyond with slower-than-light sleeper ships. By the 17th century, the Empire would have colonized its first star system outside the Romulus system, gradually expanding via sublight colony ships to many systems around Romulus, though control over these systems was difficult due to light speed lag. During this period, the Empire still lacked a proper navy. It had been 1,000 years since the exodus from Vulcan, and the threat of attack had dimmed in most Romulans' minds. At the same time, no aliens had yet been encountered, despite the large number of systems settled and the colonies posed little direct threat in space. When the need for spatial combat did arise, converted transports sufficed for the limits of combat in the period. The development of warp drive during the 19th century gave the Empire both the ability to rapidly expand further, as well as reason to develop a proper Imperial fleet, the early Navy enjoying exclusive control over faster-than-light starships within the Empire. For the next century, the Empire continued to expand largely peacefully into new systems. Though contact with at least 3 alien races was made in the period, these were mostly peaceful and eventually entered the ranks of the Empire peacefully. In a strange twist of fate, the first time that the Star Empire would use its navy in anger would not be facing a vengeful Vulcan invasion, nor an alien threat, but instead fellow Romulans. Following a succession crisis over who should assume the Imperial throne, factions broke into open fighting, which consumed the Empire for almost 50 years. When a single empress was finally selected in the middle of the 20th century, Romulan society had changed forever, becoming far more militant, suspicious, and controlling. Post-war, the Imperial Navy quickly swelled and became a key feature of life in the Empire. The Navy would next fight several Orion states, earning hard-fought victories and gaining the first stealth systems from captured pirate vessels. these eventually giving rise to the cloaking devices which would make Imperial warships feared the galaxy over in later ages. Small conflicts in border regions with the Klingons, Zenteth, Orions, Saiyans, and others typified the 21st century for the Empire. Gradually expanding and taking over several further alien races, the Romulan state would soon become one of the most powerful nations in the galaxy. Increasingly confident, and in what would later become known as a Golden Age, Imperial politicians began advocating a theory that the Empire was destined to retake their ancestral homeworld of Vulcan, and should seek out the lost system to conquer it and bring it into the Imperial fold. This faction would eventually win out in the politics of the Empire, and the Romulans began to send out fleets of ships to find Vulcan, the quest assuming an almost religious nature at the time. The planet would be found sometime in the early 22nd century, and the Empire would begin planning an ambitious war of conquest to take not just Vulcan, but the spaces separating the Empire from its ancient homeworld, and the nations within. This would become known as the Romulan Wars, and these were fought in the later half of the 2150s. To win the war, the Empire had relied on a quick victory to smash the numerous states it sought to defeat, choosing to concentrate their forces against the United Earth, which was at the time thought to be the weakest member of the new coalition of planets. But dreams of a quick victory quickly fell apart as the Empire's rapid offensives were matched and slowed by the UE, Andorian, and Tellarite. Its forces then fell apart in the face of daring UE offensives, which quickly recaptured huge amounts of territory from the Empire, and caused very real fears of the Empire's heartland itself being invaded. In reaction, many worlds and systems were bombarded to create a dead zone to shield the core of the Empire, the future neutral zone. A coup in the Empire late in the war installed a new faction in power, which quickly sued for peace with the coalition, retreating behind the neutral zone and beginning the process of rebuilding. It would be in this period that groups such as the Tal Shiar would begin to really exert their control over Romulan society, taking much power away from the Navy, which had been humiliated in the war. During a century of isolation, the Imperial Navy would gradually rebuild and develop new technologies, warily waiting for a rematch with the new Federation. In their eyes, a government formed with the express purpose of destroying the Empire. It would also be in this period that the Klingons would make repeated attempts to gain control over many border regions between themselves and the Star Empire, seeking to exploit Romulan misfortune for their own benefit. This would keep the Romulan military experienced and in fighting trim despite their isolation and defensive mindset. After a century of isolation, the Empire exploded back onto the galactic stage with two daring strikes against the enemies of the state, with new cloaked warships using plasma-based weaponry. Both the Klingons and Federation witnessing the new power of the Romulan fleet with a daring attack against many border outposts. Throughout the next 30 years, the Empire rapidly expanded, entering into a brief alliance with the Klingon Empire, from which the Navy managed to get many new technologies and warships, even co-developing a class of bird of prey with the Klingons during the 2270s. The Empire maintained tense relations with the Federation, though. They were never as hostile as the Klingons, even allowing a limited degree of trade with the Federation for a time. But relations between the two could never be described as cordial. During this period, the Navy rapidly modernized their forces, using the Klingon ships given to them as part of the Alliance as a base to develop many new warship designs and using cloaking devices to allow them to penetrate deep into Federation territory on intelligence-gathering missions. Tensions would steadily build during the final quarter of the century, culminating in the Tomid Incident of 2311 and subsequent Treaty of Algeron, which saw the Empire once again retreat behind their borders, this time into a half-century of isolation. When the Star Empire eventually made fresh contact with the Federation, it would be after several border systems were attacked and their settlements completely destroyed. In time, it would be discovered that the Borg were responsible for these attacks. Since their reintroduction on the galactic stage, the Star Empire has alternated rapidly between neutrality and antagonistic relationships with their neighbors. The Empire intervening in the Klingon Civil War, but keeping out of the border wars between the Cardassian Union and Federation. Since its reemergence, the Navy relies on massive warbirds as the centerpiece for its forces, deploying the D'Deridex as the centerpiece for most of their fleets, task forces, and battle groups. These ships give the Starfleet a potent and very difficult-to-destroy center of their fleets, easily capable of matching the most powerful warships of their neighbors. These ships would be heavily tested during the Dominion War, which the Empire entered sometime after the combat first began, in reaction to the death of Senator Vreenak. During the war, Romulan warships proved to be highly resilient, and gave Allied forces a vital staying power against Dominion counterparts. Imperial vessels saw much service, and the Empire, in hand with their allies, fought the largest and most destructive conflict the area had seen since the Romulan Wars 2 centuries prior. Imperial commanders getting along as well as could be expected with Allied commanders, though the Empire generally refused to integrate their forces with those of the Klingons or Federation. In the immediate post-war, the question of what the Empire was to do next was on everyone's mind, with debates raging, debates which were put to an end with the violent death of the entire Senate and ascension of Praetor Shinzon to power. Following his death after an abortive attack on the Federation using a highly advanced Romulan warship, the Empire seems poised to enter a new period of isolationism from the wider galactic community. In the present period, the Star Empire divides its forces into fleets, wings, and flights, each highly specialized depending on the mission it is expected to perform. A fleet is the largest formation within the Navy, being tasked with defending a specific area or region of space. Fleets vary in their composition and number depending on the area they are to defend, importance of their operating area and task they are to perform. An interior fleet expected to mostly patrol and enforce Romulan law will obviously have fewer warbirds than a frontier fleet being built up for an offensive. The wing is a formation centered around a group of warbirds with supporting elements. Wings are often standing formations, though less temporary formations are also raised to perform special tasks. Again, the number, size, and exact composition of a wing can vary greatly depending on just what the wing is expected to do, with attack wings being heavily slanted towards the heavy end of the spectrum, while a patrol wing will have more escorts and scouts. And finally, we have the flight, a formation comprised of ships of a single type, which at the lower end operate together in a subsector or a specific part of the border, or at the heavier end, made up of warbird and stormbirds, which are at the center of wings and fleets. The Empire uses 3 basic classifications for its ships, these being the warbird, the largest and most powerful type analogous to the battleship and heavy cruiser of other fleets, the Stormbird, a mid-sized cruiser with multi-role capabilities, and the Bird of Prey, a small scout, escort, and attack craft, each type featuring a broad range of variability in size, ability, and role, depending on class. While it lacks an official name, the Navy of the Romulan Star Empire has a long and storied history stretching back over 2,000 years. In this long time, enduring hideous defeats and achieving stunning victories, the fortunes of the Navy are tied strongly to those of the Empire itself. Today, the fleet is a leader of the galaxy and represents one of the most powerful factions in the known galaxy, second only to the Starfleet of the United Federation of Planets in power, and as possibly the power which has benefited the most from the chaos of the Dominion War, The fortunes of the fleet, and by extension the Empire itself, seem bright.